Hi everyone, it's time for our May blocks for the Civil War Sew-Along. If you're just joining us, we're using Barbara Brackman's book, Civil War Sampler. There are 50 quilt blocks in this book, and we're doing one each week for 50 weeks. This is the series for May. I'm releasing the blocks in the order that I'm doing them, and we're doing one each week. So the month of May has 4 weeks, so you'll receive 4 blocks. This month, the blocks are number 5, 6, 7, and 13. Now, I have received some messages saying, why aren't you working in order? Well, what I've done is I went through the book and I collected and organized the blocks into common units. For example, this month we're going to be using half square triangles. Last month we were using flying geese. Now I do understand, and I've received some messages from some of you that are not doing this as part of the 9 Patch a Day group on Facebook, which is a group that I host, and it's free to participate in and it's free to join. It is a private Facebook group, but if you'd like to join us there, you're welcome to do that. It's 9, the word 9, Patch a Day group on Facebook. Some of you are purchasing this as a block of the month. So you get a shipment from a quilt shop that sends you the fabrics that you need, and you've already purchased the book. That's not something that I was involved in, so that's why you're working in numerical order and we are not. But you're welcome to join us and follow along with us if you would like to. There's no fee to participate, other than you do need to own the Civil War Sampler book, because that's where your block information is. Now, this is not a class on how to do these. I'm simply filming little suggestions and tips and things that I've done that have made little changes in my blocks. So let's get started, because this month we're going to be working on half square triangles. As you can see, I've taken and adjusted my book. So if you're just starting with us, the reason that mine's in a binder is because I've cut the spine off of my book and had it hole punched so that I could put it into a binder and it will lay flat. And that allows me to put pages in between, page protectors, where I store my blocks. So you can do the same thing with yours. Your local office supply store will do this for you. You can have it either hole punched or put into a binder so that it's already spiral bound. Now, the instructions for how to make half square triangle blocks are on page 6 and 7. The difference between the two is this is for making 8-inch blocks. This is for making the 12-inch blocks. The thing that's a little confusing in the instructions is that there's clearly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different methods, different sizes that are cut in order to make half square triangles. So you don't necessarily know which ones go with which blocks. In the note up here, it says, use your favorite method for making half square triangles. So for this particular month, I'm going to start with block 7. So if we go to block 7 here, you can see that it's all half square triangles. So I can make identical half square triangles here, and then I'm ready to go. I am making 8-inch blocks for my quilt. So this would be 2, 4, 6, 8. So these are 2 inches. That means the squares are cut 2.5 inches, and there'll be 2 inches in my finished quilt. The half square triangle blocks are cut a variety of different sizes depending on what your favorite method of making half square triangles would be. So let's talk about that. If I'm going to make half square triangles, and so let's take a look at this. This is my cutting mat, and this is a 2.5-inch strip of fabric. I can use a specialty ruler if I would like to make my half square triangles, and in my case I would choose to use the Quick Trim and Circle ruler. I designed this ruler for Creative Grids, so naturally it's my go-to ruler. Now, I've already cleaned up the edge of this here so that my selvage edges are removed. If you are making pairs of half square triangles, the way they are in block number 7, I would put 2 strips of fabric right sides together. But for this demo, I'm just cutting up 1 strip of fabric. Now, to cut the first one, this ruler has white lines that cross at the 1/4 inch line. Lots of different rulers in the Creative Grids brand now have those same lines right there. So you can make a half square triangle cut like this. So I can cut this first one like this. So it's a 2.5 inch strip, so it will be a 2.5 inch finished half square triangle. Notice when I cut it, one of the dog ears is missing and one is still available right there. Now, that's the way we want it to be. I feed this pointed end into my machine first because my needle goes in right here, and that point gives my feed dog something to grab onto. So now I'm ready to cut my second one, and in order to cut the half square triangles from a strip with no waste, you need the quick trim and circle ruler because it's this second cut that is not available on the other rulers. There's one black line on the ruler. This black diagonal line will line up right here like this with the first cut, and the bottom edge of the ruler should stay even with the bottom edge of the strip. That line is 3/8 of an inch from that edge, so that's what makes this work. That's the math involved. So that piece and that piece are identical. Now there's lots of other specialty rulers that you can use as well. So you can do it with a specialty ruler that has a 45-degree angle like this. This is the 45-90 ruler because this end cuts a 45, this one cuts a 90. So you can use this one as well. And if you use this one, you line up the 2-inch line. Make sure that you understand how your tools work. This particular ruler was designed so that it gives you the finished size of the unit, not the cut size. It's still a 2.5 inch strip, but I'm using the 2-inch line because that's the finished size I want of my half square triangles. And to use this, I would cut one this direction and then one this direction. So I would rotate my ruler. We don't flip them over, we rotate them. Now there's also, this is my other favorite tool to use for this. This is the folded corner clipper. So notice that this one will line up exactly the same. It'll have a blunt tip up here, and this one lines up on the 2.5 inch line because that's the size of the strip. So if I cut here, and then here, so I can use a specialty ruler in order to cut my half square triangles. If I choose to not use a specialty tool and I want to cut them from 2.5 inch squares, then I would cut them like this so that it's a 2.5 inch square, and then I would cut it diagonally, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I would line my 1/4 inch line up to go point to point. When you do that, you have what we call a waist triangle. So that is not going to be used. This is the same as all of these, but both dog ears have been trimmed. Now I know that some of you have learned to do the draw a line method where you draw a line and sew on each side of the line. If you do that, you need a larger square. And that's where the book instructions come into play. So you'll see that here for the 8-inch block, it tells you to cut squares 2 and 7/8. If you cut them 2 and 7/8 and you draw the line, you can sew on each side of the line and end up with 2 half square triangles. Now the 3.5 and the 4 7/8 are too large for our project, so you would want to trim those down. Now, in my experience, rather than cut 2 7/8, almost everyone ends up cutting them 3, sewing, trimming them, and then squaring them up to the size needed. So if you'd like to do it that way, you can do it that way as well. There's also triangles on a roll. So let me grab a piece of that paper and I'll show you how that works. Triangles on a roll is a paper product that comes in a long roll. Now you can get triangle paper in sheets, you can get it in all different sizes, different manufacturers. This particular one is from It's Sew Emma, and you always buy your triangle paper in the finished size. So this is 2-inch finished half square triangles, which is what we would need for this particular blocks that we're doing this month. Now, these that I have here are smaller. These are finished 1.5 inches, and they're for a totally separate project. But this is the way the triangle paper works. You take 2 layers of fabric and you put them right sides together, and then you put your paper on top. Personally, I like to put it on top of the lighter shade, because that means when I press, I can leave the paper on and press to the dark without having to flip anything or tear the paper off first. By leaving the paper on, it also stabilizes my seams so that I don't stretch them out of shape. But you simply roll out as much of the paper that you need for however many, and remember, this makes 1 square makes 2, so that's 2, 4, 6, 8. So to make 8, we would only need that much of our paper. But you roll out as much as you would like, put it on your fabrics are right sides together, and then sew on the dotted lines and cut on the solid lines. So I've already trimmed the excess from around the outside edge here so that I don't have any excess fabric. Then I went back and cut my horizontal and verticals on the solid lines. And I always cut those first because those need to be exact. And then cut the diagonals. So when you've cut the diagonals, that's your seam allowance. So if your ruler shifts a little bit in there, we're not concerned about it. But those verticals and horizontals have to be cut perfectly. And so now this is all separated like this. So there are individual little half square triangles already made. So now the paper's on this side. I would go to my iron and press this along here. And it's not I'm going to make sure it's open the whole way across, but it's not going to distort because the paper is still attached. You have to be careful not to stretch it this way, but if you iron with this, then you will not be able to stretch it. You do have dog ears that need to be trimmed, and those should be trimmed because you don't want that bulk in your seam allowance. And then once they're trimmed, your units are pressed, then you just simply tear the paper off. So I tear from the center out like this, and then pull this out, and you will have perfect half square triangles every single time. Now you can use triangle paper to make your half square triangles, or you can use any of the cutting methods I demonstrated, or whatever your favorite half square triangle method is, in order to make half square triangles for these units that measure 2.5 inches raw edge to raw edge if you're making the 8-inch finished blocks. If you're making the 12-inch finished blocks, then your half square triangles should measure 3.5 inches from raw edge to raw edge. For this block, I've chosen to use a solid with a little small print on it, and then 2 shades of the same color. I've chosen this pink and red to go together, and you notice that all of my dark triangles are on one side of the block and my lights are on the other. We're starting with block number 7 because it is really the simplest block in this series. Now, I can put this together in lots of different ways. I can choose to go put my rows together and then press my seams in one direction and then a row, and press those seams in the opposite direction. So I can put them together like that. I can also put it together in a 4 patch. So I would join these 4 together, these 4, and these 4. And that will work for you as well. So whichever way is more comfortable for you will work. Now I will say that pressing instruction-wise, if you've used triangle paper, they're all pressed towards the dark. But when you sew this unit together right here, whether it's in rows or just in a 4, the seam is pressed this way and the seam is pressed that way. So it adds a little bit additional bulk right in that corner. So just to distribute the bulk, I would choose to take these 4 and press them in the opposite direction. That just means pressing them open and then to the lighter side rather than the darker side. But all we're going to do is sew these together in either rows or groups of 4. However that works best for you. Now I do want to show you that in the book there's a bit of discrepancy in my mind. When you look at the unit here, you notice it's laid out the way I have mine laid out, with all of one color on one side, another color on the other side. But if you're following the sample, they've turned the units so that instead of having the diagonal going this way, they have it going this way. Now, either way would work. That would be perfectly fine. But if you notice here, the red is on that side, the red is on that side, but then the red matches in the middle, but then that red is on the opposite side. So to balance your block, if you like this look, this one should be turned in the opposite direction so that on these two, the same color points in. And on these, the colors point in. So they should all, as in the layout, go in one direction, or they can alternate and they can face towards the center. But they should all do the exact same thing. This is my block number 7 all finished, and I used the web technique to put the whole thing together. If that's a technique you haven't tried before, then I think either block 7 or 6 is the perfect opportunity to experiment with that technique. You may try it and find out it's something you love. Block number 5 is called Hovering Hawks. And this is a very popular block, and you're going to see that we're going to use the same triangles, but not necessarily make half square triangles. When you look at the block, it's all done with half square triangles and 4 solid squares on the outside and 2 solid squares on the inside. And you're certainly welcome to make it that way. There's no problem following those directions. However, I like to eliminate as many seams as possible when I'm constructing a block. And sewing these 2 triangles onto another square of the same fabric creates a lot more seams than we actually need in the block. So I'm going to cut that larger piece as one unit. So let's take a look at my block and we'll see how I put it together. Now I'm making 8-inch blocks, so my solid squares were cut 2.5 inches. If you're making the larger 12-inch blocks, you'll be cutting your squares 3.5 inches as instructed in the book. Now the squares are finished at 2 inches and my half square triangles are also finished at 2 inches. But you notice all of my triangles don't make a block. I'm putting my block together in rows like this. So these are my 4 rows of units. I have a square, a half square triangle that's been assembled, and then an extra triangle on the end. The same with this row, half square triangle, solid square, half square triangle, and an extra triangle on the end. This is the exact same row reversed, and this is the exact same row of this reversed. Now when I put these together, I'm going to have to fill in this triangle on either side, and I'm going to cut that from one fabric. Now these are the 4 center rows of my blocks sewn together, and I need to cut my triangles to go on either side. Now how would I decide how large to cut those? Well, they have to span 2 rows. Each row is 2 inches, so that's 4 inches. Then I have to add my seam allowance. We can't just cut them at 4.5 because we have a diagonal seam allowance. That's where that 7/8 inch measurement comes into play. So to make them fit exactly, they would need to be cut 1 square, 4 and 7/8 inches. Then that would be cut in half and put on either side like this. Now, using that same slop and chop technique, I've decided that I would cut mine 5 inches, so they're about 1/8 of an inch too large. Once they're sewn on, then I will use my 8.5 inch square up ruler to trim my block to size. The other thing I want to mention before we move on is that you notice that the outside edge of my block is all green, and it's a darker shade with this light section down the center. That looks very different than the version that I've made for my batik version of this quilt. For this version, I did use all individual squares, but I scrapped the background fabrics so that there was a whole variety of them in there. The difference between these 2 blocks is this one is very dark compared to this one, which is very light. That has to do with the sashing pieces I've chosen. For this quilt, I'm going to have 2 dark sashing with a light in the middle. For this quilt, I will have 2 light sashing with a black one in the middle. And that's just my personal preference. But I think you need to consider as you're making your blocks whether you want them to be dark on the outside edge or light on the outside edge, because these are the exact same blocks. The last block for the month of May is block number 13, London Square. For this block, we're going to be using the same technique that we used in our last block, where you're cutting half square triangle pieces, but not all of them are going to be made into squares. If you look at the illustration that's over here, and you'll see that I put some marks in my book. I like to have a paper book rather than a digital book so that I can make notes in it. And this was my reminder to tell me that I wanted to sew this together in rows rather than in diagonal strips. You could put this block together by sewing this diagonal row of triangles together and this diagonal row of triangles, and then you would sew that together and then add your triangles. But those would all be bias seams. So rather than make it more difficult, I would like to make it easier. So I'm going to put them together in the same short little rows. This will have a half square triangle and an extra triangle. This will have 2 extra triangles on either side of that half square triangle unit. So I'll show you how I put mine together in a minute. But first, I wanted to talk about the illustrations that are here because they're not the same. This illustration here shows that the F triangle down here, the dark gold, matches the 3 on the opposite side of the pieced diagonal. So here, this is the F triangle, and there's the 3 that match. Over here, this is your F triangle, but they've arranged it so that the 3 are background colors. Now, it doesn't really make any difference if you mix them up and if you rearrange your pieces, but don't look at this one and cut everything you need and then look at this one to try and sew it together because it can be confusing. Now, what size are these triangles going to be? In your illustrations, it says for the B size and the F size. And when it has cutting down here, it says exactly what you're going to need. The F triangle is the large one and the B is the small one. And those letters refer all the way back to the cutting pages we talked about in the very beginning of the book. So an F triangle for an 8-inch block would be 6 7/8. But as I discussed, almost everyone I know is going to round it up to 7 sew the triangles in place, and then trim that extra little 1/8 of an inch off if necessary. Now, if you're making the larger 12-inch blocks, that's a 9 7/8 inch square that you're going to cut diagonally. So that's a pretty big piece of fabric that you're cutting a square, and then you're cutting it diagonally, and you're only going to use one triangle because they're different. So you need 2 different squares cut diagonally. This triangle that you don't use can be cut down into smaller pieces or used for another block at another time. But right now, you're only going to need half. Now your small pieces, the B ones, are 2 7/8 or 3 7/8. If you're going to follow the book instructions, cut it diagonally, match up your pieces, and then use each half of that as your half square triangle. But you can use any of the instructions that I went over in the very beginning of this video about how to make half square triangles. So I made my 4 half square triangles for this block, and I took a look at all of the blocks that I had made already, and I chose to make most of this month's blocks using a green fabric of some kind, because what I've done so far seemed to have a lot of red in it and a good amount of brown as well. So I added some green to the selection during this month. So these are my 4 half square triangle blocks. I'm going to add a background triangle to this side as it's illustrated in the book. And I will add the smaller version of a half square triangle on this side. Now I'm going to sew these together in rows. So these will be sewn together, these will be sewn together, these will be sewn together, and these will be sewn together. Now pay particular attention to which side of the triangle you're sewing things on so that everything ends up in the right place. And then once I have those rows together, I'll match my intersections and sew those short rows together. And then I can add this triangle and this triangle to complete my block. Now I've laid mine out the same way it's shown in the book, where my large F triangle here matches the 3 across here, and this large F triangle matches the 4 across here. And that's why you have to pay particular attention to how many you're cutting out, so that you have the right number of pieces to complete your block. Now that I have my center rows sewn together, I can go ahead and add my larger F-size triangles on each side. Now when I add these triangles, I want to make sure that they're centered right down the middle here. So you don't want to shift them off to one side and find out you've got too much at one end and not enough at the other. So you want to make sure that they're centered. You're going to sew them, and then those seams will get pressed towards the larger triangles. Now once I've done that, I'll be ready to trim up my block. And I shouldn't have more than just a tiny 1/8 of an inch to trim off of these sides, where I oversized those large triangles. Rather than cut 6 7/8, I cut them 7. Now let me finish my block and we can wrap up the month of May. Here's my completed lucky block number 13. So now I've finished all of my blocks for May, and I hope you enjoy making yours as well. Just a reminder, this is the inside page from the book, which shows the finished quilt using all 50 blocks, and they're done in 8-inch size. Now, when you look at this quilt, you'll see, if you study it, that there are some blocks in this particular quilt that are not in our book. So if you see this diagram that's in my binder, that's what I've been keeping track of. It doesn't make any difference. We have 50 blocks. They're just not the exact same 50 blocks that are shown here. The ones that are featured in our book are the ones that had wonderful stories to go along with them. So I hope you're enjoying those stories. So now you can work on your May blocks for our Civil War sampler, and I'll see you in June for the next set of blocks.